Usman Hadi, who died, was not a student but a university lecturer, sir. Now, Motleb Sikdar, the latest victim to be shot and wounded, is 42 years old, sir. So I was just going through the profiles of the so-called student leaders as being reported by Western press. They are not students, sir. I mean, you don't have 42-year-old student. You don't have lecturers as student. I'm not being like a MAGA conspiracist, but the fact is that these are not students. They are people masquerading as students. Not all of them are students, sir. There is also a narrative issue in Bangladesh as if some sort of a revolution has taken place without understanding that a lot of vicious forces involved which have anti-India position.
That's right, Karthikeya. Starting way back from 2011 Tahrir Square, this so-called civil society and more recently Generation Z, for example, has come to symbolize protests which have puzzled one after another country. We have seen in our own neighborhood, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal. So when we say that perhaps we are not able to reckon this emerging radicalism perhaps earlier than this, it's partly because of this sudden explosion that of this nature happens, of perhaps subdued, simmering kind of radicalism over a period of time and suddenly erupts. And that is what is happening in Bangladesh as well. And that kind of question remains. But I think the important question here is, as you mentioned, even if they are, having some backers, there are, countries or organizations who are orchestrating some of these, as Shobir was trying to mention. How does India deal with this? I think this is a rather complex situation here, where, of course, India as a major regional power has to be careful as to how it addresses some of these issues. We don't want to see some of the smaller nations ganging up together and looking at India as a bully. So India has to run that very fine line of allowing, of course, Indian citizens freedom of speech, freedom of protesting, but making sure that institutions are privileged and not emotions are privileged. And therefore, various mechanisms, whether it is high commissions on both sides or other mechanisms of information intelligence sharing, as much things happen beyond visibility. I think that approach must be applied here. And we should make sure that this kind of anxiety doesn't lead to polarization. Focus has to be seeking justice for minorities. And I agree with this. Whenever something goes wrong with Muslims in China or in United States, we on your television speak about why Islamic countries are not talking. So I understand there's a responsibility that India has. If minorities, particularly Hindu minorities, are being lynched the way this has happened in Maiman Singh, India has a responsibility to respond to it and make sure that minorities are protected. But how does one address that issue? I think that is something which is very, very complex, and the fine line between, radicalizing them far more by allowing them to build the narrative of India being the bully, and making sure whether we are able to engage with the interim government and make sure that we are able to focusing on justice, using institutions and allowing freedom of protest without any harm coming to Bangladesh High Commission or any other representative here. And that, I think, is a difficult exercise when you have India, which is a celebrated democracy, where people feel very confident in protesting, and you're hearing on your screen some of the very agitated people who are openly very critical of the government here itself, and they want perhaps, for example, cricket matches not to include Bangladesh players. But that, I think, is something one has to be very careful, whether you want to turn this into a social political polarization or you want to focus on piecemeal back channel conversations for seeking justice. And that, I think, is something which is the pressure point that India must use to make sure that the regime in Bangladesh, the interim government in Bangladesh, listens to India's narratives and is answerable, is found answerable. There have been some instances before also when we have seen the so-called chief advisor making some kinds of lip services in this direction of being responsible for protecting minorities in Bangladesh. But if it doesn't deliver on the ground, I think we have to keep on nudging, insisting, persuading that these things are completely unacceptable, and these are basic human rights
But you see,
that are expected
Professor
of
Swin,
an
there are a lot of unacceptable. Professor Swansingh, closing statement from you.
I think two things very quickly. One, that of course there is a certain frenzy that we notice because of this radicalization in Bangladesh. We are really concerned about Indian Hindus as minorities being protected there. But that frenzy is not exclusively against Indian minorities. You saw the Daily Star office, Pratham Alo office, Mr. Osman Hadi being killed, Mr. Sikdar being attempted. So, it's a larger frenzy, and we have to put things in perspective in that sense. And second, I understand there is a youth leader of Pakistan Muslim League, Kamran Saeed Usmani, who mentioned something that, in case Bangladesh is under any danger, Pakistan would be ready to help them. And earlier, some terrorist outfits have also mentioned that they will be, using that eastern flank to attack India, etc. But these, as Manoj Joshi said, are basically rumors. They can create certain rhetorical kind of influence in media, social media, etc. ISI over a period of time can perhaps help these terrorist outfits to also find some space in Bangladesh, but India will know over a period of time.
Okay.
So there is nothing to panic as of now, but I think main focus of India should be A, how to ensure Indian Hindu minorities are feeling safe in Bangladesh, and if at all India can contribute in not letting that frenzy in Bangladesh go any further and grow much more. And how to control that, I think whatever India can do, of course, in along with the interim government, there is something that is required, because frenzy must come down so that sanity can survive, and some communication can then take place as to how to ask the chief advisor to deliver safety and security for all minorities. Particularly, India would be concerned with Hindu minority in Bangladesh, which has shrunk over a period of time.
Yes.
You opened the program by saying how the numbers have gone down.
Yes.
Which really means that over years, the successive governments in Bangladesh have not been able to give protection, safety, security to Hindus in Bangladesh. The frenzy now makes it up in the face, and I think it's an ongoing exercise for India, which is something we should look at in terms of longer term perspective.